In a previous video, we discussed the fundamental concept of energy. We are going to expand our discussion to talk about work. To review, let's look at the conservation of energy. The conservation of energy tells us that energy cannot be created or destroyed. You can move energy from one place to another, or change it from one form to another, but the total amount of energy never changes. And let's look at the example of having a ball go up into the air. We said the ball is going to leave the ground with an initial linear kinetic energy of some arbitrary value E. And on the ground, its gravitational potential energy is going to be equal to 0. When the ball gets to its apex, its velocity is going to be 0, and therefore its linear kinetic energy is also going to be 0. However, now it has some height off of the ground, so it's going to have a certain amount of gravitational potential energy. How much? Well, the gravitational potential energy is going to be equal to that arbitrary value E, which was the amount of linear kinetic energy it had at takeoff. And what we had happen here was all the linear kinetic energy was transformed into gravitational potential energy. On the way back down, all that gravitational potential energy is being converted into linear kinetic energy, and it's going to land on the ground with the same linear kinetic energy it had at takeoff. In the previous video, I mentioned that sometimes the energy within a system can change. And certainly you can ask the questions about where did the energy initially come from to launch this ball into the air, and when the ball landed on the ground, where did that energy go? That is the focus of this video. How do we change the amount of energy that's available in a system? Again, we cannot change the total amount of energy, but we can either put energy into or take energy out of a particular system. The process by which that occurs is called work. Work is the process by which we either increase or decrease the amount of energy in a system. Let's take a look at how that occurs. First, let's take a look at gravitational potential energy. If we have an object that's starting on the ground, let's say a barbell for example, and we raise that barbell up to a certain height, we've changed its gravitational potential energy. Where did that energy come from? Well, it was through a process called work. We applied a force as we lifted that object up off of the ground. The formula for work is going to be the force times the displacement. In this particular case, the displacement was in the positive direction, and the force was also in the positive direction. Since the force is positive and the displacement is positive, positive times positive is positive, and we have positive work. How we interpret that positive work is going to be generating energy, or increasing the amount of energy in something, or putting more energy into a particular system. Similarly, once that barbell is raised to its height, we can lower that barbell back down. As we are lowering that barbell down, we are going to be applying a force opposite the direction of gravity, particularly if we're slowly lowering that object down. In this particular case here, we are going to be applying a force which is in the positive direction, but the displacement happens to be negative. If we have a positive times a negative, then we have a negative work value. And we interpret the negative work to mean that we are absorbing energy with that force. We are taking energy out of the object or system, in this case the barbell. The same case will apply to kinetic energy. Let's say that we have an object that's moving with a certain velocity. If we apply a force that's in the direction of that velocity vector, that is known as a propulsive force. Propulsive forces, as you know, are going to lead to an increase in velocity. So if we applied that force over a given distance, then we have increased the energy within that particular body or object. Again, in this particular case, the force is positive, the displacement is positive, and therefore the work is going to be positive. And we interpret it positive work to mean that we are generating energy with that force, or that we are increasing the amount of energy or putting energy into that particular system. Recall our runners. We said that she's going to start with a certain velocity. At another point in time, if she ends up speeding up, she sped up because there was a force that was applied in order to speed her up. That force is increasing her velocity and therefore is doing work on her and increasing the amount of kinetic energy that she has. Recall that energy is a scalar, so we cannot represent that with an arrow like we do vectors. So I'm going to represent energy being a scalar as a tank. And we have a certain amount of energy in the tank. If at a given time later we have more energy in the tank, then we can say that we've increased the amount of energy. We increased the amount of energy because the force and the displacement were both going in the positive direction. And positive times positive is positive, so we can say that that positive work means that force is generating energy or delivering energy to whatever our system is that that force is being applied to. Now, that force need not be applied in the positive direction. A negative force that's applied to an object that's moving in the negative direction is still a propulsive force. And negative times negative is still positive. So even though the force is negative, if the displacement is negative, then we still have a propulsive force and we are still increasing the amount of energy in that particular system that the force is being applied to. Now, we can also have a scenario where an object is moving with a certain velocity, and then we are going to apply a braking force. Braking forces, as you know, are forces that are applied opposite of the direction of travel, and the effect is going to be to slow an object down or to decrease its amount of kinetic energy. That force applied over a distance is going to be doing work on that particular object. In this particular case here, it is going to be taking energy out of that particular system as it decreases its velocity, which is decreasing its kinetic energy. And again, our formula for work is going to be equal to the force times the displacement. And if the force and displacement are in opposite directions, then we have negative work. Negative work again means that that force is absorbing energy or it's taking energy out of the system that that force is being applied to. So again, if we look at our runner and she's running with a certain velocity, and then at another time she's running slower than she was previously, she had to have had a force that was applied opposite her direction of travel. That's the braking force that slowed her down, therefore decreasing her velocity, and if we decrease velocity, we're going to have a decrease in kinetic energy. So again, we have a certain amount of energy in the tank, and then we have less energy in the tank. That means we had an overall decrease in energy. The decrease in energy means that we had to have had a force and a displacement that were in opposite directions. In this case, we have a positive force and a negative displacement, and positive times negative is negative. And again, we interpret that negative work to mean that we have that force absorbing energy or taking energy out of whatever system that force is being applied to. Again, we don't need to have the force always being positive. As long as the force and the displacements are in opposite direction, such as here where we have a negative force and a positive displacement, we're going to have negative work. Much like what we said with momentum and forces, and that we said that in order to be effective, a force had to be applied over time, from a work energy perspective, we can say in order for a force to be effective in changing the amount of energy in a system, that force has to be applied over a distance. Now let's shift our attention to angular motion. It doesn't matter whether the barbell or dumbbell is going to be traveling in a linear path or an angular path. If we move from position A to position B, we have increased the amount of gravitational potential energy because now this mass is going to be higher from the ground than it was previously. In this case, since we are talking about an angular motion, we had to apply a torque. And the torque was going to be applied in the direction to raise this object up off of the ground. And again, we can say that work is going to now be equal to the torque times the angular displacement, which is analogous to saying the force times the linear displacement. And again, we are going to interpret that work as being positive or negative the same way. And since we did positive work with that torque generated energy, or that torque delivered energy to that particular system that was rotating. Similarly, we can say that we are now in the top position and we are going to lower back down via an angular motion. Well, now we've decreased the amount of gravitational potential energy in that particular system. So now, again, we are going to apply a torque. That torque is going to be opposite of that rotation to slow it down to where it hits the ground. And again, the work is going to be equal to the torque times the angular displacement. And since the torque and angular displacements are now in opposite directions, we are going to have negative work, or that torque is going to absorb energy, or it's going to take energy out of that rotating system. We can also talk about it from a kinetic energy standpoint. So we can talk about an object that's rotating with a certain angular velocity, and therefore it's going to have a certain amount of angular kinetic energy. If we apply a torque that's going to be in the same direction as the rotation, that's going to be a propulsive torque, and that propulsive torque is going to cause the object to speed up. Again, that torque has to be applied over an angular displacement, and if that torque and angular displacements are in the same direction, we have positive work where that torque is generating energy and increasing the amount of kinetic energy of that rotating system. So if we take the example here again of two baseball bats, and if a bat is rotating at a certain angular velocity, and if we increase the amount of angular velocity of that baseball bat, we had to have applied a torque that's going in the same direction as the rotation. So we start with a certain amount of energy in the tank, and we increase the amount of energy in the tank. That means we had to have an increase in the total amount of energy. In this particular case here, that means the torque and the angular displacement have to be going in the same direction. If the torque and the angular displacement are in the same direction, in this case they're both negative, so negative times negative is positive, we have positive work, or that torque is generating energy, or that torque is increasing the energy of that rotating system. And again, whether or not the torque is positive or negative is somewhat irrelevant. What's relevant is whether or not that torque is going in the same direction as the angular displacement. So in this case here, now the torque is going in the opposite direction, in this case positive, but then so is the angular displacement. And positive times positive is positive, so again we have that positive work that's generating energy and delivering it to the rotating system. Similarly, we can talk about that object that's rotating with a certain angular velocity, and if we apply a torque that's in the opposite direction of that rotation, we are now going to slow down that rotation because that now is going to be a braking torque. Braking torques, opposite direction of the rotation, slow it down. If we slow down the angular velocity, we are decreasing the amount of kinetic energy. So here we can talk about the work as being equal to the torque times the angular displacement. In this case, if the torque and angular displacements are in opposite directions, then we have negative work, in which case that torque is absorbing energy from that rotating system, and we now have a decrease in kinetic energy of that rotating system. So if we go back to our bat example, if we're starting with a bat that's rotating with a certain angular velocity, and now we slow it down, we are going to have had a torque that was in the opposite direction of that rotation. So again, we have a certain amount of energy in the tank. If we decrease the amount of energy we have in the tank, then we had to have had a torque and an angular displacement that were in opposite directions. In this case, our torque is positive, our angular displacement is negative, and positive times negative is negative. So we have negative work, in which that torque is absorbing energy, or that torque is taking energy away from that rotating system. And again, the direction of the torque is somewhat irrelevant as long as the torque and the angular displacements are in opposite direction. as in the case here where now the torque is negative and the angular displacement is positive, as long as the torque and displacement are in opposite direction, we're going to have a negative work sign, and that negative work means that torque is absorbing energy or taking energy out of that particular system. And much like what we talked about with force, we can say that in order to be effective, specifically in order to be effective in changing the energy of a rotating system, a torque has to be applied over an angular distance. If we want to talk about changing the angular momentum, we talk about changing it over time. But since we're talking about changing the energy in the system here, we're talking about an angular displacement. So to summarize, we can say that if something speeds up or is raised higher from the ground, its energy increases. And a force or a torque in the same direction generated that energy. Similarly, if something slows down or is lowered towards the ground, its energy decreases. And we had to have a force or a torque that was applied in the opposite direction in order to absorb that energy. Next, I'd like to briefly say something about what is doing the work. We just don't want to say work, because what we want to say is the work of a particular force, because it's forces that do work, so it's important that we identify the force. So we can talk about the work of an effective force. The work of an effective force is going to change the kinetic energy, and only the kinetic energy, of a particular system. But if we were going to be talking about, say, the ground reaction force, that ground reaction force is going to change not only the linear kinetic energy, but also the gravitational potential energy of that system. And this is something that we'll talk more about in our discussion groups. Also in our discussion groups, I'm going to ask you to trace the energy of a vertical jump. See if you can trace where the energy is coming from and where the energy is going to throughout the course of that jump. Now, I am a big proponent of using work energy methods, but there are some peculiar things about work. Let's say I'm going to take a barbell and I'm going to load up that barbell and I'm going to make it really heavy and I'm going to do a lot of squats with that barbell. Okay, let's say I do 20, even 50 squats with that barbell. And let's say I have anywhere from 500 to even 1,000 pounds on that barbell. What's crazy about work energy methods is that if that barbell stops and ends in the same place, and if it starts at 0 velocity and ends with 0 velocity, that means we had no change in its kinetic energy, and we had no change in its potential energy, and therefore we did no work on that barbell. Which, if you think about it, is really pretty horrible to think that I squatted 10 times with 500 pounds and I did no work. Additionally, if I were just to hold an object in a particular position against gravity over a period of time, I've still done no work. The gravitational potential energy hasn't changed, the kinetic energy hasn't changed, and yet I'm going to expend some sort of effort holding that barbell or that dumbbell in position. And so it's important to realize, as good as work energy methods are, that we cannot equate work energy methods with physiologic effort. And we may have to modify work energy methods to get around some of these peculiar situations. One way we can get around this peculiarity is with a concept referred to as mechanical energy expenditure. By the classic definition of work, we have to add together both the positive and the negative work as algebraic sums. So in the case of our squat, we saw that the negative work canceled out the positive work, and we had a total work of 0. With mechanical energy expenditure, we are going to take the positive work, and instead of adding that to the negative work, we are going to add that to the absolute value of the negative work. In other words, we're going to make that negative work positive, and we would add the two together. By adding the positive work to the absolute value of the negative work, we are going to get a value that might be more truly representative of what is happening. because rather than having zero work performed during a squat, we are going to add the absolute value of the negative work during the down phase of the squat to the positive values of the up phase of the squat in order to get value. And there you have it. There's our discussion on work.